This mass murder in Buffalo targeted a black community, tried to find a community in New York that was mostly black. He knew New York had very tough gun laws, so most of the people clearly wouldn't be armed. And he went there with the mindset of slaughtering as many black people as he could, and he did. 10 people were murdered. It is a horrific, horrific crime. And yet the media almost instantaneously started to turn this into a political issue, and not just a political issue. I suspect most of the people who were murdered that day, most of their families, came to the United States long before many of our ancestors did. What does that have to do with immigration and replacement theory? Well, he wrote about it in his so-called manifesto. He wrote about a lot of sick things in his manifesto, including his constant hatred for the Jews, and that the Jews were behind everything, and the Jews were behind the Great Replacement movement. And yet, I haven't heard the media in America talk about his anti-Semitism. They talk about replacement theory. And why is that? Why is it? Because there's a big chunk of the Democrat Party, even elected Democrats, and in the media, including the New York Times, that are virulently anti-Semitic. So they would never have a finger pointed at themselves. Remember the cartoon the New York Times ran with President Trump holding a leash, and at the end of the leash wasn't a dog, it was Netanyahu. Remember that? Oh, that was an accident. And I suppose not covering the Holocaust was an accident. They just forgot about it. And I could go on in their coverage of the state of Israel vis-a-vis the terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and terrorist countries like Iran. But that's not the point of tonight's program. So let's look at immigration very, very briefly. Maybe one day I'll look at it more broadly with you. And it's very interesting, this so-called replacement theory. It's more of a replacement ideology, and it has been pushed and pushed and pushed by the left, the media, and the Democrat Party for decades. For decades. And I start with this question, America, that I've been asking on radio for months. Why is the southern border wide open? Why? It doesn't help us economically for anybody and everybody to pour over the border. It doesn't help us in terms of the health and safety of the nation for everybody and anybody to come into the country to pour over the border, particularly with the lax rules in place by this administration. School districts are overwhelmed. Local law enforcement's overwhelmed. Local hospitals are overwhelmed. We're talking about millions of people now. Why is a Democrat president and a Democrat Congress and a Democrat administration supporting wide open borders like no administration in modern American history, violating existing federal immigration laws and reversing virtually all of Donald Trump's policies and refusing to complete a wall? Why are they doing it? What's their policy purpose? They don't tell us. They don't tell us why they're doing this. But the media tell us, and the Democrats tell us in their own way, not in any official statement, but they tell us in their own way. You can Google or Bing or DuckDuck, and you will find case after case after case where the Democrat Party leadership and the media say exactly the same thing. The browning or the blacking of America, reducing the number of the white population. And I've said on my radio show for years, why do they keep talking like this? I don't talk like this. Why do they keep talking like this? That's not the purpose of immigration, to change the complexion of America and so forth. What kind of racist nonsense is that? Well, that's exactly what it is. And so now if you raise a finger and say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Oh, you might be a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi. Let me tell you folks something about white supremacists and neo-Nazis. There's a website called Stormfront. And they used to have a big picture of me on Stormfront with a Star of David and a long hook nose and an old hat. And they used to trash me left and right all the time. And I noticed they took the graphic down when I would call them out. But it was constant. It was anti-Semitic. And the threats that I get to my safety and to my life, they don't come from black nationalists. They don't come from Islamists. they come from neo-Nazis and white supremacists. Why? Because I'm a Jew. That's why. So when I see this guy in Buffalo slaughtering these people because of their race, that's his objective, and saying the Jews are behind it, it comes as no surprise to me that he also denounces conservatism. Well, he says what he is. He's a nationalist, eco-socialist. Well, that doesn't sound like a constitutional conservative to me. That doesn't even sound like a Republican to me. And the media don't focus on any of this. They don't talk about any of it. Instead, it's the great replacement theory. Okay, well, let's talk about their theory and their ideology and whether it's reality or not. In 1965, the Democrat Congress, urged by Lyndon Johnson and a senator you may have heard of, Ted Kennedy, passed the Hart-Celler Act. It completely changed our immigration laws, and it put in place chain migration. And the immigration laws used to be balanced more toward Europe, and these laws would now, or this law would balance it more toward what we call the third world or developing nations. But don't worry, Kennedy said, that's not going to change the quote-unquote complexion of the nation. Don't worry about it. And so it passed overwhelmingly in the Democrat Senate, and then the Democrat House. And then it was signed by Lyndon Johnson. Now we have massive open borders, massive illegal immigration. They promised this sort of thing would never happen. The late author Theodore White, as I explained in Liberty and Tyranny, no conservative, he wrote that the Immigration Act of 1965 changed all previous patterns, and in so doing probably changed the future of America. It was noble, revolutionary, and probably the most thoughtless of the many acts of the Great Society. In the 1960s, Cesar Chavez, the bust of whom was in Obama's office, and they celebrated his birthday as a great civil rights event. Cesar Chavez, one of the founders of the United Farm Workers Union, the UFW, vehemently opposed illegal immigration, arguing it undermined his efforts to unionize farm workers and improve working conditions and wages for American citizen workers. The UFW even reported illegal immigrants to the then Immigration and Naturalization Service. In 1969, Chavez organized and led a march accompanied by Ralph Abernathy, who had been Martin Luther King's lieutenant. He was president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Senator Walter Mondale, you may have heard of him, along the border with Mexico, protesting the farmers' use of illegal immigrants. And this goes on and on and on until these unions decided, well, it might be in our best interest to, rather than fight, to join, because maybe we can unionize these people. Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. was an advisor to John Kennedy. He's credited with helping write Profiles in Courage, among others, and an advisor to Lyndon Johnson. In the end, he didn't much care for Lyndon Johnson, but he was a huge liberal Democrat intellectual with enormous influence in the Democrat Party. He wrote a little reported book called The Disuniting of America. And throughout the book, he talks about how ethnicities and creeds and backgrounds and the celebrating of each and the indoctrination about each and the classroom and the teaching of each and so forth, and immigration that is not curbed or not controlled will lead to the destruction of the United States. That's Arthur Schlesinger Jr. You can look it up yourself. You can get the book, The Disunity of America. Then there was Dick Lamb, the former Democrat governor of Colorado. Gave a fairly famous speech in Washington, D.C. in 2003, and it was entitled, My Secret Plan to Destroy America. I have a secret plan to destroy America if you believe, as many do, that America's too smug, too white bread, too self-satisfied, too rich. Let's destroy America. It's not that hard to do. History shows that nations are more fragile than their citizens think. No nation in history has survived the ravages of time. And he gives a list of the things you need to do. And we're doing it, according to his list. What does he talk about? Bilingual, a bicultural country, multiculturalism. He talks about having sections of the country, like they have Quebec, French-speaking, in different parts of Canada. We can do that with different ethnic minorities and so forth. He talks about the fastest growing demographic group, young foreigners, and and their dropout rates from schools. He just goes on and on and on. I guess he was a white supremacist long before his time. He would also say that these subjects are off limits. Can't talk about them. I'd make it taboo. And you'd be a heretic if you dare to mention it. A heretic. And he says, lastly, I would censor Victor Davis Hanson's book, Mexophonia. This book is dangerous. And he's saying this sarcastically. It exposes my plan to destroy America. So please, please, if you feel that America deserves to be destroyed, please, please, don't buy his book. This guy is onto my plan, says Dick Lamb. So how did we get from there to this is a Republican ideology that's being pushed here? The fact is that the Democrats have pushed this great replacement ideology, and the Democrats are now criticizing, I guess, former Democrats for pushing the great replacement ideology. But the fact of the matter is, these things are occurring. The census says so. Joe Biden says so. Joe Scarborough says so. Democrat after Democrat, whether they're dressed up as journalists or politicians, says so. And apparently we're not allowed to talk about it, and we're not even allowed to be concerned about it. My big concern is a lack of assimilation. You can't have people pouring over the border. Meanwhile, people are being taught newly in elementary school to hate their own country. How do you assimilate people into a culture, into a society if you do that? And then finally, on this issue of anti-Semitism, the Democrats won't raise it because they accept it more and more. The squad keeps spreading lies about Jews and about Israel. They did so literally 48 hours after the Buffalo mass murder, and after he says in his so-called manifesto that the Jews are behind all these things and so forth. And they're pushing something called Nakba, which is a mythical retelling of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, in which the would-be genocidal armies that failed to destroy the newborn Jewish state and kill all its inhabitants, this is the Daily News, hardly a conservative paper, along with those who tried to help them do it, have been romantically recast as the helpless victims of a horrible catastrophe. Have you heard anyone on MSNBC criticize this? No. In fact, one radical host had Tlaib on to explain it, to explain her propaganda without challenge. The Democrat Party has not denounced this. Nobody on CNN or MSNBC has denounced this. Nobody in the New York Times or the Washington Post has denounced this. No, because the squad and a growing number of Democrats in Congress are anti-Semites. It's that simple. And there's so few Jews in this country and around the world that the Democrat Party more and more apparently has made the decision who they're going to throw in with. And they've thrown in with the squad.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.